today our topic is talking about the 2023 proxy season and what's coming from a variety of perspectives as we think about not only the activist investors, but the SEC and what folks are looking at in terms of peeking around corners to future-proof your business and make sure you're embedding workplace equity as a core tenet of creating durability, especially in this economic uncertainty we find ourselves in. So let's talk housekeeping just for a moment. We love to run these webinars as a conversation. So we have two incredible panelists whom I'll introduce in just a moment, but we want to hear from you. We love answering your questions. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar. You don't need to wait until the end for the Q&A section. And there's two options to do that. You can use the Q&A box or the chat box, depending on whether you want to be anonymous or not. So we give you two options just so that you have every opportunity to ask a question, maybe even a question that you feel a little vulnerable asking. So depending on which way you want to go, those are your two options. And again, please feel free to ask questions as soon as you'd like. Next, we'll go into looking ahead to the proxy season. We have a couple of slides for you, but then we like to pull those down and just have a conversation amongst the three of us, as well as all of you. So with that, let's get started. So who are we? Who is Syndio? We're obviously hosting this event. So my name is Maria Colacurcio, and I'm the CEO of Syndio. And Syndio is a workplace equity platform. So what that means is we help companies analyze and resolve pay and opportunity gaps that are because of something like gender, race, or ethnicity. We have about 260 customers, primarily the Fortune 2000, that trust us to do this work. And what we're finding, especially within the last 6 to 8 months, is that this has become table stakes. So looking at these issues and embedding workplace equity into your business is now something that is required in order to create that enduring nature and to drive toward profitability and to ensure that you're retaining your top talent and reducing attrition amongst the folks that you really do want to keep in an environment like the one we're in. So we'll be talking a little bit more about how you can also embed workplace equity to future-proof and think about how to see around corners as it relates to proxy and what's coming in terms of regulation and compliance. So we'll be touching on that as well. But first, I want to introduce my panelists. We're really lucky to have the guests that we have today, and I think you're going to learn a ton from them. So if we do this right, I'll be speaking less, they'll be speaking more. So first we have Katie LaVoy, who is counsel at Sidley Austin. So she's counsel in the Chicago office and regularly advises on matters of corporate governance, SEC disclosure requirement, and exec comp. Her practice, however, includes board and committee governance, a topic which I know is important to a lot of you, leadership, policies, composition, structure, best practices, fiduciary duty, board evals, shareholder engagement, exec and director compensation, and then all things disclosure and corporate structure security laws. So everything we're going to be talking about today, you have an incredible resource that really understands not only what present tense looks like, but what future tense will look like. Katie's a former general counsel and chief compliance officer of a publicly traded maritime company, and she has an extensive career prior to that. So Katie, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Maria.
And then we have Ashley Marchand Orme, who is the director of corporate equity at Just Capital. So she is responsible for overseeing the development, implementation, and strategy of the organization's equity programs. So through Just Capital's participation in the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, she's part of a team of specialists working to develop voluntary corporate performance standards on racial equity. So again, another great resource for you. So please, again, use the Q&A and chat to ask questions. Prior to joining Just, she served most recently as the Associate Director of Governance Content at the National Association of Corporate Directors. So if you have served on a board, you are very familiar with NACD as an organization. And she led education and research on board oversight of diversity, equity, inclusion, amongst other topics. She earned her master's in integrated marketing from Georgetown, and her thought leadership has been featured by several news outlets. You'll see her name all over the place: Fortune, MarketWatch, CNBC, etc. So Ashley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Maria. Great to be here.
So with that, let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about the landscape. So looking ahead to the 2023 proxy season, there's a lot of talk about the SEC, human capital disclosures, and what's to come. We really do believe that some of these new regulations or disclosures, requirements could lead to more shareholder proposals, and that's something we'll be talking about. There's certainly a universal proxy rule that's in effect. And these virtual shareholder meetings that we've been seeing pop up over the last couple of years, those are definitely here to stay. I think when we think about what's to come in the 2023 proxy season, we learn a lot by digging in and looking at what happened in 22. And as we look at 22, we can just quickly peruse some of the headlines. As we look to 23, we can peruse some of the headlines from 22. So if we go to the next slide, you can see a couple of things that have really started to hit mainstream. So when you think about Disney losing the shareholder vote on pay equity disclosure, the requests for disclosure of median pay gap were certainly on the rise. Not all of them passed, but more passed than ever before. And you're starting to hear more about proposals that have to do with disclosure transparency around things like gender and race audits. You're also starting to see this, as you see in that last headline down at the bottom, the pay gap resolutions are starting to hit a bit of the mainstream. And when you think about that in context with the pay transparency legislation that's accelerating very quickly around the country, one of the things that's not widely reported on, in addition to simply posting the salary range with any new role in which you're advertising, a lot of these transparency laws also require mean and median reporting to the state. For example, in California's pay transparency law, SB 1162, for those of you who are following in the detail. So what we're seeing is, as you look at how the pay transparency legislation is accelerating and evolving, we are moving to more of a push around that mean median. So looking back, a few statistics of 22, and then we'll talk about how we think that will inform and push 23. So 21% of workplace equity proposals passed last year among just the Fortune 100 is what we're looking at with that number. 58% received more than 1/3 of shareholder support. So even in the case of those that failed, they were still receiving quite a few votes. And you can see here in terms of percent of total equity assets under management, just what the breakdown is in terms of case-by-case support or full support. And it lends itself to an accelerating trend, certainly, of seeing these. And then it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of what types of companies are passing them and where they're getting the support and where they're not. So as we move to the next slide, I want to hand it over to Ashley to talk a little bit about some recent research from Just Capital, because it's really critical that as we think about workplace equity and embedding this into our companies, we're not just thinking about this as a way to reduce risk of a pay equity class action, of a shareholder proposal, because there is more and more research coming out that shows a clear linkage to profitability, to creating durability, to having an enduring company, and all of the benefits that are clearly linked from a return on investment when you prioritize this work. So I want to hand it off to Ashley to share some of those findings.
Thanks so much, Maria. At Just Capital, we've been conducting more and more research on the links between performance and the prioritization of stakeholders as determined by the ESG metrics that we analyze. This slide just isolates Q4 of last year. The big trend across the research we've done the last couple of years is that there are correlations between companies that score better on human capital metrics and outperformance compared with their peers who don't perform as well on those same metrics. So if you're looking at the slide, D1, that category of D1 shows the top decile companies in terms of worker issues compared to the lower performing D10 companies or the bottom decile. So what you can see here is that those companies that perform better on our metrics related to health, benefits, DEI, and career advancement outperform their peers. That orange bar is the spread, the difference between top and bottom performers. I'll note here, you may be looking at the far left side, which is that wages category. Just a quick note that I wouldn't read that as companies performing well on wages typically perform worse than their peers. Rather, it's important to note this was one quarter in which we had a couple of outliers in the consumer discretionary industry. That included Burlington stores. Last year had a really strong stock rally, and there were a couple of outliers that impacted those Q4 numbers for wages. But if you broaden out beyond Q4 and just look at the year in totality, you'll see that the companies in the top decile actually did better in terms of wages and other quarters of 2022. I'll just note, just feel free to check out Just Capital's website. We have additional research on outperformance of companies that prioritize ESG, and again, especially the human capital metrics that we look at. And Maria, back to you.
Thank you so much. So that's all we have for our kind of canned presentation part. So Joni, you can take the slides down and we'll just move into the discussion, because I think this will be where folks really get the value out of this session. And again, I encourage you to ask your questions. So I want to start with the concept of ESG. Ashley, you just touched on it a little bit, but it tends to be a bit consumed, at least in the media, by the E. When we think about environmental, we think about carbon, we think about this entire topic. But lately, and based on what you just shared, we've seen equity audits and shareholder proposals that are focused more on the S, social, being a bit squishy and opaque in terms of its definition, but would be really curious to get each of your perspectives on how do you think that trend will continue? How is it taking shape, and how will it manifest itself? And whichever one of you would like to answer first.
Sure. Well, I can kick things off. Thank you, Maria. Ashley, such really interesting statistics there, and I look forward to reading more about that report. So, I think the S is so interesting because it really does cover such a wide range of issues, squishy, as you put it, Maria. But I think that, broadly speaking, as long as stakeholders are interested in social topics and social activism, we are going to see more workplace equity proposals. And this is really, I think, a confluence of a couple of factors. You have shareholders that are expressing their voices more actively. Excuse me, over the last 5 years, we've seen an increase in the number of shareholder proposals in both the S&P 500 and the Russell 3000. But then you also have not just the increase in proposals, but this increase in pay equity and racial audit proposals, as well as more leniency by the SEC staff in allowing these proposals to go to a vote. So I do think that this trend will continue, that we'll see more as long as society at large is interested in these issues. Now we have a little bit of an economic situation here and some volatility, so it'll be interesting to see how that economic trend impacts what we're seeing from our stakeholders.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think we will see this trend continue. And as Katie is saying, in some areas, the conversation around the S may evolve a bit more, because of the level of investor pressure over the last couple of years for companies to disclose, for example, their EEO-1 reports or workforce diversity data. We did see an uptick in transparency on workforce diversity. You may now see investors asking more of those questions about whether companies are lagging in their workforce diversity or setting goals, asking more specific questions about those, what they're seeing in those EEO-1 reports, and asking companies if they're making plans to make progress there. So I think, given the economic environment and what we saw last year, there's just going to probably be more increased focus on engaging with companies around the S issues that they think really are most material for the companies.
And I appreciate you each discussing that a bit, because we are seeing more pressure on it, but there's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the proposals around things that have to do with the S, whether it's a gender race audit, seem to be going up, but the folks voting in favor seem to be trending down a bit. Is that just because of the number of proposals are starting to increase, or how would you kind of reconcile those two things, and what do you see the trend moving toward?
That's a difficult one, Maria. I think, when I look at that, I think you need to look into the breakdown of who is voting here. And we're seeing some trends there. So obviously you need to look at your institutional investors. From a policy perspective, a lot of the institutional investors are saying that they will vote on a case-by-case basis. But when you actually look at their voting patterns, a lot of them are voting with management here. Some of them are still considered on case by case, as you showed in your initial statistics. There are some that will routinely vote with management, but it's not a huge trend here. You have these institutional investors saying that they support ESG proposals, but it's really not coming out in how they are voting. So I think that's one really important thing to pay attention to.
Yeah, and we may talk a little bit about this later, but in terms of just thinking through what investors say, and again, there may be that dissonance between what they've sort of signaled and what they end up doing in terms of proposals and their votes. But the EY recently published a report on trends for proxy season 2023, and they had talked to about 60 institutional investors that had $48 trillion in assets under management. And people issues, things like talent shortages or the failure to upskill workers, were the top category. That was the top category, people issues, cited by these investors as being the top concern for them leading into proxy season. And then furthermore, when EY asked investors which issues they plan to engage with companies about, you might expect that the top answers would be more explicitly about economic conditions, but investors share that they were expecting to engage with companies around number one was climate risk and the energy transition. Number two was workforce and board diversity. And then third was strategic workforce issues beyond diversity. So I think investors are at least signaling to companies that they're planning to engage around these issues. And sort of as Katie was saying, we'll sort of see how this plays out in terms of what that means for voting and proposals this season.
Yeah, just to build off that, Ashley, I think that's such a great point about what people say they're interested in. I saw another survey by another one of our great accounting firms, PwC, that said that 81% of surveyed investors were reluctant, though, to take a hit on their investment returns that exceeded 1% in pursuit of ESG goals. So people are passionately interested from kind of a moral and societal perspective, but not if it costs them investment returns. But I think it's so short-sighted, and I'll stop there, because I think that when we talk about ESG goals, we need to consider what the investment benefits of that are. But if people have this perception that kind of putting their money where their mouth is going to cost them, I think that's an issue.
Yeah, and Ashley, talk a little bit more about that, because obviously the research that you all are pursuing and have done with ties to the Russell Index and other things, you're really finding a strong tie between companies that prioritize these people issues, and you're actually finding rankings of which ones are the most important. Is that because of the direct tie to reducing attrition, or what are you seeing in terms of why investing and valuing people is now so closely linked to performance? And I guess my follow-up question, Katie, for you would be, what's it going to take for people to understand that there is this direct link versus feeling like this is still a nice to have?
It's such a good question, Maria. And I think I'll sort of preface it by saying, at Just Capital, when I talk about us looking at metrics, ESG metrics, we look at over 200 plus data points for the Russell 1000. So we have analysts who are looking through all of these issues related to the environment, social and governance issues. And, a lot of the charts that we create, a lot of the research that we've done really does focus in on that correlation between outperformance, and we kind of weight things based on what we hear from the American public. We do extensive polling of the American public. We do focus groups to understand what issues they think are really important, and that's sort of helps us determine our weighting for some of what we do in terms of scoring. That being said, a lot of our research looks at correlations, so we can see that companies that are more transparent about issues like equity-related issues, or companies that prioritize our stakeholders by scoring better, in human capital metrics, will typically outperform, their peers who are not shown to be as transparent, not shown to be performing as well in those areas. So we've honed in on correlation specifically. I will note that part of what we're trying to think through and hypothesizing is, around this big question of disclosure. Is it that the companies who are being really specific and being really transparent just are better at overseeing these human capital areas and paying more attention to them? And that's why they're able to stay ahead of risk and think through opportunities So that's just one sort of hypothesis, but that's what we're looking at internally a little bit more.
Yep. And Maria, on what's it going to take? I think that it's about education and communication with your shareholders. I think that to justify your ESG considerations in terms of dollars is important, and it can be done. I think there's a lot that you can talk about here that's compelling from a dollars and cents perspective. And I'm putting aside here kind of what my personal belief on the right thing to do is, because I certainly have a perspective on that as a woman in the corporate world. And I should note that the things that I expressed today in terms of opinion are mine. They are not those of my firm, Sidley Austin. But putting that personal perspective aside, I think that there is a real business and financial perspective that's important to talk about. Reputation has a financial benefit and a financial cost. How you treat your employees, your ability to attract and retain employees, especially in this labor market, has a financial benefit and a financial cost. Your ability to gather and leverage diverse perspectives has a performance and a financial benefit. I mean, there have been so many studies across the years showing that having diversity amongst your workforce benefits you from that financial perspective. So those are all things that we talk about the topic being squishy, but it's really not a squishy result when you look at how that benefits your organization, and that's dollars.
Yeah, I mean, when you break it down like that and you off the top of your head give that list of things, I mean, every single one of those has a clear financial impact.
Absolutely.
And I do think that there's this realization on behalf of investors that there is a true linkage. And so now it's really up to the board, and let's talk a little bit more about that. I would love to dig in and to ask you, has the focus on increasing diversity, meaning making sure that your board composition includes people from diverse backgrounds, whether it's gender, race, ethnicity, has that shifted how boards are thinking about this and pushing for this? Have you seen an evolution because of coming out of that focus on board diversity? And where do you think that's going to go next? I mean, obviously there's been like the California proposal to rethink that. And as part of that, we also have, several of these anti-woke proposals. So can you talk a little bit more about, first, did pushing for that additional diversity on boards change things in terms of this linkage? And then let's move into sort of the backlash on the flip side.
Sure. Yeah. So, Ashley, I'm happy to kick this off. But yeah, if we look at the last 10 to 15 years, there's no doubt that there has been an increased focus on diversity on the board. And I think it's not just because of it's not just because of these societal pressures. I really do think that companies are understanding the value of those diverse perspectives and understanding the value that kind of conversation brings at the board level. And so I do expect that to consider, regardless of what state or federal laws happen to issue, because I think that companies are understanding the intrinsic value.
The only thing I'll add to that quickly is that, over the past couple of years, especially even heard from nominating and governance committee chairs that the focus on board diversity really does offer boards an opportunity to pause and sort of reconsider their composition more broadly. So it allows boards to actually think really critically about, who do we have on the board now? What best serves the company's strategy moving forward? How do we think about our composition, and what skills do we need to bring in? As they're thinking about diversifying their board. So I think there is that additional sort of benefit of being a little bit more strategic, about board composition and what's serving the company well in that season.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. And it's interesting that, one of the proposals that's pretty common that doesn't get a lot of airtime is the fact that many times companies will have board members that are overboarded. They're on 9, 10, 11, 12 boards, and that can also be a risk. And I think some of these pushes or pressure toward board diversity is also opening up an opportunity for folks to say, this gives us a little bit more breathing room and a little bit more opportunity to find folks to serve that are not already completely oversaturated with the number of boards upon which they serve, because that's also a risk for companies.
Yeah, I think there's really a balance of finding experienced directors, but then also finding people with this great diversity of experience and giving those people an opportunity to have their perspectives heard.
Definitely. Yeah, we'd seen some upticks in the last couple of years in first-time board members who are joining, public company boards. So I think companies can decide that that is helpful in many respects, but also just ensuring that the way that we think about diversifying boards is a bit more expansive than what maybe people have thought about in the past. So you may not have somebody coming in who's been experienced as a CEO, but they may have significant experience leading a really large business line at another company. So companies have seemingly been a little bit more open to thinking through the experience that they really need on the board and how that translates in terms of a candidate's board resume, what actually transfers over. That's helpful.
So audience question, and I'm happy to jump in on this one too, but Ashley, I think you'll have some good information on this, and Katie, you as well. The question is, how are companies measuring impact of these investments? So what metrics are they using and how are they connecting it to value creation? So have you seen any discussions around measurement yet in these board conversations that you're sitting in, or potentially, Ashley, obviously you're asking that question in your research?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of how people are measuring impact, I think there's a lot of focus on how are these companies basically performing in terms of their stock compared to peer companies. In terms of specific metrics, that's a good question. This is a question that a lot of companies had been asking, especially about the S and ESG over the past 10 years. I think folks have gotten a lot smarter in terms of ESG raters and rankers, folks like Just Capital and other organizations, in pointing companies toward metrics are helpful to be considering. I mentioned earlier that at Just Capital we do a lot of polling of the American public. We talk to the investor community. We have focus groups that we hold to determine what those key metrics are and how to weight them in terms of our scoring. But we have a full list of, I think it's, like I said before, 200 plus data points where we actually break down what it means for companies to focus in on their workers. That includes wages, that includes health and safety of the workers, that includes things like apprenticeship programs, hiring practices, internal promotion rates. So in terms of specific metrics, that's what we're looking at. There's a full list of methodology on our website that tells you all of the specific metrics that we point companies toward. But there are quite a few. So if there's any question about what metrics to use, there are a slew out there from companies just like ours who are pointing towards human capital issues.
And Katie, one for you. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the SEC. Mm-hmm. So what are you seeing in terms of the SEC? Obviously, there's been a couple of changes around universal proxy rules. They're talking more, we call it pay explainability with pay transparency, but kind of at the executive board director level. What are you seeing happen now and the implications, and what are you advising clients as to how to prepare for what's next?
Sure. So, has the SEC been busy over the last couple of years here? The amount of rulemaking that is happening in the SEC is at just a breakneck speed. We have not seen anything like this in a decade, perhaps, if not longer. So you've seen a couple of things come out recently. We saw pay versus performance come out, and that's, right there, some pay explainability. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of that. And I say that because this was such a hot topic 10 years ago. And it took a really long time for rulemaking to come out. But we have CEO pay ratio. Now we have pay versus performance. But you don't hear people talking about CEO pay ratio really anymore, unless it's those really crazy ratios. And that's usually because, frankly, a one-time pay decision, and it's not perpetual. And I'm afraid that pay versus performance is going to go the same way, which is companies are going to spend all this time and all this money. Because I have to tell you, those are not easy disclosures to put together. And I get concerned that investors are not going to get the value out of that they should be. And so I'm not sure I have a solution for that. But the data is going to be out there now. And I really think that shareholders should be paying attention to that and looking at how how the executives are motivated. And that's really, I think, the point there. You can look at the numbers, and I think a lot of the practitioners have some issues with how compensation actually paid is constructed, but it is what it is. And looking at the why pay and performance are either matched or mismatched. And that to me is the important part. And so when you look at those disclosures, it's really important not to just look at the visuals. So don't just look at the table, don't just look at the graph. You need to look and pay attention to the why, because that's really the explainability part, not just kind of the pretty tables and graphs, or not so pretty tables and graphs.
And is there more pressure on that second piece? Like, should companies be preparing to explain the why?
Well, they do. So there's another part of the proxy statement, which is where this paper's performance disclosure will be published. It's the CD&A, and in there they are supposed to explain the why. And if you do read that section, I'm a self-proclaimed proxy nerd. I love proxies. I read a lot of them, and if you look at really good proxy statements and really good CD&As, they tell you why. And sometimes the board and the compensation committee are getting it right, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes that is we can lay blame for that sometimes on the board, but sometimes, frankly, it's economic and performance factors. But making sure that they are explaining the why, which is required, is an important element of understanding that holistic pay explainability.
And before we move you off that topic, I'm putting you on the spot, but do you have off the top of your head an example of a company getting it right? Like what that in your proxy nerd travels through these statements? Like what's an example of someone really getting it right? Is it the level of detail? Is it they get to the policy or the behavior level, or what are they doing to really get it right?
Sure. So I'm gonna refrain from using names, because otherwise I might have some clients that are annoyed that I'm not using their examples. But I think the companies that are getting it right are really digging into the motivation. So if you use, and I'm just throwing out some examples, if you're using cash flow as your main motivation for how you pay your executives, explaining how controlling cash flow affects your business. What is it about cash flow that makes your performance better or worse, and why? How are we seeing that arc over the last couple of years? And I also think that it can be a little dangerous if you're only using one metric. And I know this is actually it's a gripe of some of the proxy advisors, that they're not using more than one thing. On the other hand, if there is some behavior that you truly want to motivate your executives with, maybe there is a reason for using only one metric, but you need to explain that and talk about not just what it is, but the time frame in which you're evaluating those metrics is all very important, because this should be, as we said, a very holistic program and explainability.
Got it. And Ashley, what type of impact do you think some of the SEC's universal proxy rules are going to have? Do you think we'll see even more board diversity or more shareholder engagement around workplace equity? I mean, do you have any thoughts on what the outcome might be?
I think it's a little bit early to say. Obviously, I never love crystal ball questions, but I think in terms of what we'll actually see, I think we'll see just stronger shareholder engagement around, board member skill sets. I think that's going to be important. I think there's going to be a critical eye on individual director skill sets and thinking through, well, what exactly is this board member bringing to the table in terms of their experience and fitness for purpose, specifically because of the business environment we're sort of in right now and coming out of. So I think there's going to be just greater scrutiny in terms of issues like things like director overboarding, which we were talking about earlier. So I think those are a couple of the topics that are going to be rising to the surface a bit more.
And with that, let's spend a minute on the sort of the flip side of the coin. I mean, we are seeing a bit of a rise in what are being framed themselves as anti-woke proposals. So can you define what these look like and how much of a backlash is really there? How much of this is just, sort of trumped up in the media, or is this a real thing? How should organizations be prepared to address this?
Sure. So I can start off with that. So I think when we talk about anti-woke proposals, what I view that is stakeholders, whether it be investors or whether it be, we've seen quite a bit from attorney generals of certain states, really saying to businesses, business is business. Why are we talking about all of these ancillary issues? And I'm really giving it a very one-on-one level there. Why are we talking about ESG? They're saying, why aren't we focusing on our financial returns? And I think these are important conversations to have. I think that people have visceral reactions when you say ESG or anti-woke, but really there should be a conversation about these things. I think that these anti-woke proposals are making good points. They are saying, show me the connection between your ESG values and how you're running the company, and why is your company performing better because you're focusing on these issues. And I think those are valid questions to ask. It is not the job of the board to say, we love ESG, we're going to focus on it, it is material to us. Well, ESG is such a large topic. What is it about social proposals and social initiatives that is important to your business? What is it about environmental that is important to your business? And picking out those things that are material to your company, that are important for your organization's value and long-term returns to your shareholders. Because at the end of the day, if you are not providing returns to your investors, you're not going to be in business for very long. And that means that all those employees and stakeholders that you're trying to help aren't going to have jobs. So I know I really went all over the place on that response. But I think the important point here is, let's not have these visceral reactions to anti-woke or ESG. Let's look at what these people are concerned about on both sides and have this conversation about the value of both of the perspectives.
And Katie, you're going exactly the direction I was going to, which I'll just underline the importance of getting specific. I do agree. It's easy to get lost in jargon, terms, initialisms like ESG and DEI. So if a company's feeling nervous about backlash against ESG issues, it's probably worth considering what issues really do matter to you and what matters to your stakeholders, whether that be workforce issues, things like pay equity, the energy transition, et cetera, and just be really clear about why those are focused areas for your company.
Yeah, and despite, one thing we were planning to talk about today is, despite kind of the messaging around ESG and the overreach, only 43% of America's largest 100 employers, if I'm getting that right, disclose conducting pay equity analyses. So again, pay equity analyses has become table stakes. That's just simply making sure you do not have unlawful pay disparities because of something like gender, race, or ethnicity. But only 43% of America's largest 100 employers disclose conducting those with a specific focus on race and ethnicity. And I think over the past, 4 years ago, it was very much a gender topic. And now, fast forward, this is about looking at it from a variety of perspectives. So to your points, Ashley, more than half of the Russell 1000 disclose some form of race and ethnic data about their workforce, which is up 23%, but only about 11% are going into the intersectional data. So do you think that shareholders are going to sort of catch on to this and start requesting more detailed data as it relates to that intersection between the things we talked about?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, right, one of the things that you mentioned is that 43%. What this signals to us is that there's just significant room for improvement, right, in the Russell 1000 to be more transparent, in terms of these issues. I think, when we see things like only 11% of companies, providing that more detailed intersectional data, that can suggest that some companies are doing it a little bit more as a check the box, or there might be some disparities that are stronger for some groups than others, and companies want to be risk averse and not provide that level of transparency into what the details look like. So I think in those cases, we may very well have some investors who are asking those more specific questions. And the more specific you get, right, the harder it is to hide specific data. And I think that's what investors are looking for. They want to know if you're going to disclose some of this information, if you're going to talk about this information, or if you're not going to disclose it, we're going to ask some specific questions. Investors want to know that companies are thinking about this in a detailed way, right? That it's not just a check the box activity. So I think we're going to see more attention for sure in this area of pay equity specifically. And we've seen an uptick even in the last couple of years in terms of companies even disclosing information about their pay gap analyses. So I think we're going to continue to see this be an issue of importance for investors.
And the only thing that I would add there, Ashley and Maria, is I do think we're going to see a regulatory response here. The SEC has said that it is going to propose rule amendments to enhance disclosures about human capital management sometime this spring. We'll see, given their agenda, when they get to it. But when those rules are proposed, even though I also, like Ashley, hesitate on the crystal ball, but I do predict that we're going to see requirements to disclose metrics on certain workplace diversity items, amongst other human capital items. That this is, I'm going to be honest, this is not an earth-shattering prediction. When the human capital disclosure rules were finalized back in 2020, the dissenting commissioners published statements that were very critical of the exclusion of metrics from the final rule. So now that those, now that the Democratic appointed commissioners are in control, I do think that we will see metrics required when we see amendments to the human capital disclosure requirements.
It definitely feels like that's the way this is going. I mean, if you think about the E and more from the perspective of the whole conversation around global warming before it became climate. And it seems like we're kind of in that same squishy place because, Katie, to your point, and even Ashley, some of the things that you said, reputation, brand, some of those things are not quantifiable yet. And so until we can really show through some of the research that Just Capital is doing amongst others, that less bias equals better results, or that focusing on your people equals more profitability, higher stock price, which is a huge part of what you're working on at Just. I think it's going to be interesting to watch the navigation of kind of this ESG religion, which you outlined before, Katie, which is sort of this conversation of you're either over here or over here. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. So I want to make sure that I ask you both, as you think about advice that you're giving to clients, to customers, Ashley, if you're thinking about the rankings and what you would suggest to companies as they want to be part of the positive side of these rankings. And Katie, I'll start with you. What advice are you giving to clients on how to be ready for what's coming in the next 12 to 18 months as it relates to proxy proposals, some of this regulation you mentioned? Are you guiding them on what they should be communicating, how they should be thinking about articulating policies that define pay? I mean, what are you telling them?
Yeah, Maria, I always like to default to process and preparation when I talk to my clients. I think that making sure that you're having a holistic process, that you are engaging with your shareholders, that you're having these important discussions at the board level, that's really important to making sure that you're ready to be responsive to what is coming. And process, frankly, and transparency can cure a lot of ills. I think that the companies that are going to have problems are the ones that just aren't having these conversations, that aren't going to be ready to think about what they're going to disclose because they're going to be behind the 8 ball. They're not having the conversations now. And so when it's time to disclose, they might not have great disclosures because they haven't thought about it. And this is something that Ashley and I actually talked about a couple of days ago, is not every company is going to have stellar statistics to disclose, but it's a journey. And Ashley, I can't remember the great phrase that you had for it, but companies are on this journey, and some things that they're doing are going to be positive disclosures, and other things are not. But not every company is perfect, and you need to have that balance of what you're disclosing to show improvement.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the idea is really around thinking through that the early journey sort of data, and being willing to share that information. And I think that, this comes down to a couple of things. It does come down to having those internal conversations, being really intentional about how you engage around the S and ESG. I know that can feel like a big term, but getting specific about what really matters to your company when it comes to the S, when it comes to social issues, how you engage with your workforce, for example, how you advance equity within your organization. Those, getting clear on those issues and what's important, I think, is really key here. And one of the things I shared when Katie and I were talking before was that we are going to see now the companies who've been leading in terms of their transparency, who's been leading and thinking through how they engage with their workforce, really benefit as we're getting it into this season of the more rulemaking. And you're going to see that whatever the SEC proposes in terms of human capital disclosures. But absent companies sharing this information, there are more and more resources available to investors and stakeholders to find that data. So if you're not disclosing it, it's possible investors will go looking for the information elsewhere. I shared an example of, we had an event last year, a Just Capital virtual event, in which we had an investor from, I think it was the New York City Comptroller's office, share that they were looking for certain data, couldn't find it. They go to sources like Glassdoor. So there are ways that investors and stakeholders can find information about your company. So it's beneficial for corporate leaders to think about, how do we get ahead of that? How do we share information about our story, even if we're not where we want to be? That's the opportunity to share goals and think through the plan to get there. So it's definitely worth having those internal conversations to get ahead of it.
We've certainly heard similar things around being able to identify, we think about customer NPS, but identifying the employee NPS and whether that's a leading indicator for stock performance. Is there a toxic CEO? Are the CEO's rankings dropping precipitously on Glassdoor and sites like that? Investors are going to blind, which is pretty interesting, just to see what are the discussions look like and what's the tenor. Last question, would just love your thoughts on, we are in a very obviously uncertain, volatile time, and it seems like all signs are pointing to the fact that shareholders will continue to prioritize these issues of workplace equity as we move into 2023, even though we are in sort of this choppy economy. I mean, any thoughts on that to leave us with in terms of thoughts?
Sure. So I think that despite what the economy does, and we've seen obviously a lot of action over the last couple of days in the media, and I think that, again, focusing on your process, focusing on your workforce. We're still in a tough labor market, and I don't think that that's something that's going to change anytime in the near future. And so making sure that you are paying attention to your employee policies, that you're looking at pay equity, that you're paying attention to your hiring processes. Those are all things that in the long term and the short term will be good for your company from both a composition perspective and a performance perspective. So stay vigilant, stay prepared, involve your board, for those important questions and processes. And it's going to be a fun ride wherever it goes.
Yeah, I'll just add to that the importance of just getting specific around those ESG issues and ensuring that you're hearing from your stakeholders. We've seen some signals of what large institutional investors are asking companies to pay attention to. So pay attention to those signals and just ensure that you've got your ear to the ground in that sense.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you both so much. As promised, we're ending at at 9:50 Pacific time to give you all 10 minutes back in your day, but really appreciate you sharing your insights. For everyone who is on the call, I know we presented a lot of really in-depth information, so we will be sharing out a recording and making sure that you have access to that as well as you want to circulate it. But really appreciate you giving us insight and a look into what's ahead, and appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.